The accepted narrative of the Battle of Stalingrad is one of almost inhuman ferocity. It is framed as the turning point of the Second World War's Eastern Front. A titanic struggle decided by sheer attrition and ideological willpower. In the ruins of a city bearing Stalin's name. But what if this assessment, while emotionally resonant, is strategically incomplete? What if the fate of the German Sixth Army was sealed not by Soviet tenacity alone, but by a catastrophic systems failure? Our objective in this briefing is to re-evaluate the engagement through a different lens, one of logistics. Now, let's open the tactical map and deconstruct the engagement. The conventional understanding of the battle, fought from August 1942 to February 1943, is dominated by the visceral imagery of the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. This was urban combat at its most brutal, a block-by-block, room-by-room fight, where life expectancy was measured in hours. Historical accounts rightly focus on the unparalleled determination of the Soviet 62nd Army under General Chuikov and the grim professionalism of General Paulus's 6th Army. Hitler's obsessive refusal to retreat and Stalin's Order 227, not one step back, are presented as the primary drivers of the conflict, turning the scene into a crucible where two totalitarian regimes bled each other white. This narrative is powerful because it is fundamentally a human story of endurance, sacrifice, and unimaginable suffering. It serves as a stark symbol of total war. However, a singular focus on the tactical struggle within the city itself obscures the fundamental strategic equation that governed the entire campaign. An intelligence assessment based solely on combatant performance on the front line is a flawed assessment. To understand the collapse of the Sixth Army, we must analyze its operational environment and, most critically, its logistical spine. The German military doctrine of blitzkrieg was predicated on speed, encirclement, and decisive victory over short campaigns. Its logistical structure was designed to support rapid advances across the well-developed infrastructure of Western Europe, where railheads and road networks could keep pace. But in the autumn of 1942, the Sixth Army stood at the banks of the Volga, over 600 kilometers from its primary supply depots. It was operating at the absolute limit of its operational ceiling. This wasn't a sudden development. It was the culmination of the entire campaign. The vast distances of the Soviet Union, coupled with a primitive road network and a different railway gauge that required painstaking conversion, stretched the German logistical chain to its breaking point. Every kilometer the Wehrmacht advanced from Poland, its supply lines grew more tenuous, more vulnerable to partisan attack, and less efficient. When we analyze the data from Army Group B's quartermasters in late 1942, the numbers are stark. The daily requirement for a German division in active combat was hundreds of tons of supplies, ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment. The capacity to deliver this tonnage was already falling short before the first Soviet counteroffensive. The German logistical system was a pyramid balanced on its point. It functioned, but it had no redundancy, no capacity to absorb a systemic shock. The Sixth Army in Stalingrad was not a besieged fortress of immense strength. From a logistical standpoint, it was a stranded asset, living on borrowed time at the end of a fraying rope. The foundation for catastrophic failure was not laid in the city's rubble, but months earlier, in the faulty strategic assumption that logistics would simply keep up. The systemic vulnerability of the Sixth Army was transformed into an acute crisis on November 19, 1942. Soviet High Command, Stavka, launched Operation Uranus. This was not a frontal assault on Stalingrad itself, but a classic deep battle pincer movement targeting the overstretched and qualitatively inferior Axis flanks, held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions. These sectors lacked the anti-tank weaponry and morale to withstand the concentrated armored spearheads of the Red Army. Within 4 days, the pincers met at Kalaknadonu, severing the Sixth Army's ground lines of communication and trapping roughly 300,000 Axis troops in a vast pocket, or Kessel. The chronic logistical problem had now become a terminal one. The Sixth Army was no longer an offensive force at the end of the supply line. It was an isolated garrison with finite resources, entirely dependent on external support for its survival. Faced with this reality, two strategic options were presented. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commander of the newly formed Army Group Dawn, advocated for an immediate breakout. This was the conventional military solution. However, a political and strategic decision from High Command overrode this assessment. Reassured by the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, that his air force could sustain the encircled army, Hitler ordered Paulus to stand fast.
Stand fast! Do not surrender!
This decision represents one of the most significant logistical miscalculations of the modern era. An analysis of the raw data shows that the promise was not merely optimistic, it was a mathematical impossibility from its inception. The Sixth Army's command calculated its minimum daily requirement to maintain combat effectiveness at approximately 750 tons of supplies. This figure accounts for ammunition, fuel, rations, medical equipment, and spare parts. For bare subsistence, a severely reduced figure of 500 tons was considered the absolute minimum. Göring's assurance was based on a flawed analogy to a previous, much smaller airlift at Demyansk. He failed to account for three critical variables: the scale of the Stalingrad pocket, the brutal Russian winter, and the strength of Soviet air defenses. The Luftwaffe's primary transport aircraft, the Junkers Ju-52, was a reliable but obsolete plane. The fleet was insufficient in number, and the operational airfields like Tatsinskaya and Morozovskaya were primitive and at the extreme edge of the aircraft's effective range. The results of the airlift, when cross-referenced with the Sixth Army's daily logs, tell the story of a cascading failure. The airlift officially began on November 24th. In its entire 72-day duration, it would exceed 300 tons delivered on only a single day. The daily average was less than 100 tons, less than 15% of the minimum required tonnage. From a systems perspective, the Sixth Army was consuming its own mass to survive. Ammunition was rationed for all but the most critical defensive actions. Food supplies dwindled, with caloric intake per soldier dropping from adequate to starvation levels. fuel reserves evaporated, rendering the Army's panzer divisions immobile metal statues. The airlift was not a lifeline. It was a futile gesture that merely prolonged the inevitable. This deficit was fatally compounded by the environment. The onset of winter saw temperatures plummet to below -30°C. For the German war machine, which was not designed for such conditions, the cold was a systemic shock. Standard lubricants for machine guns and artillery froze solid. Starting panzer engines became a monumental task that consumed enormous quantities of scarce fuel. The physical condition of the troops deteriorated rapidly. Without adequate winter clothing or nutrition, frostbite and disease became as deadly as the enemy. The Army's combat effectiveness, its ability to perform its core functions, was not just degraded. It was being systematically erased by a combination of starvation and extreme cold. The failed ground relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm in December, was a final confirmation of the strategic reality. Manstein's relief force was itself at the edge of its logistical tether and could not generate the combat power necessary to break the Soviet encirclement. By early January 1943, the Sixth Army had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist as a coherent military formation. The final analysis of the Battle of Stalingrad, therefore, requires a fundamental re-evaluation of its popular narrative. The surrender of the Sixth Army was not the dramatic conclusion to a contest of equals decided in the final moments. It was the predictable end state of a systemic logistical collapse. The data deconstructed in our previous section is unambiguous. The Soviet victory was not merely won through tenacity in the city's ruins, but was strategically secured the moment Operation Uranus severed the German army's fragile supply lines. The subsequent struggle, the Rattenkrieg, was a grim consequence of this strategic reality, not the cause of the German defeat. The Sixth Army did not run out of fighting spirit. It ran out of fuel, ammunition, food, and medicine. It was an advanced industrial army that was systematically deconstructed and neutralized by the removal of its industrial inputs. This engagement stands as a critical case study in flawed strategic assessment. The decision by German high command to rely on an airlift was not a calculated risk. It was a catastrophic failure to ground strategic objectives in logistical reality. It demonstrated a profound misunderstanding of their own system's limitations when placed in the harsh, expansive environment of the Eastern Front. The Blitzkrieg doctrine, which prioritized rapid forward momentum, had a fatal dependency on the assumption that the logistical tail could always keep pace. On the plains of Russia, this assumption was invalidated, and the entire operational concept became brittle. The Wehrmacht at Stalingrad is a historical data point that proves an army's center of gravity is often not its strongest combat unit, but its most vulnerable supply artery. From this deconstruction, we can extract an enduring strategic principle that transcends this single engagement. An army's operational capability is ultimately defined not by its combat power, but by its logistical capacity. Tactics and strategy determine how a force fights, but logistics determines if it can fight at all. This is the unyielding equation of modern industrialized warfare. The ability to project and sustain force is the true measure of a military's strength. Stalingrad is the most brutal and clear lesson in modern history that any force that allows its strategic ambition to fatally outstrip its logistical reach, has already engineered its own defeat. The enemy simply provides the time and place for the collapse to occur. The tactical maps and combat reports of history record the drama of battle, but the final verdict is often rendered in the quiet, unforgiving mathematics of supply and attrition. The Battle of Stalingrad is more than a historical event. It is a permanent and stark reminder that strategy is the art of the possible, and logistics is the unforgiving.